listening to the early joiners. We'll give it a while until we're probably 3 or 4 minutes past the hour. Let everyone join. But thanks for joining. We will get started in a little while. Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. We are going to wait till a couple of minutes past the hour to get going. We definitely need Jay Mack, who's going to be covering the topic on the call. But welcome, and we'll start soon. Hey, Renato, are you sharing your screen for a particular reason, or did you not know you were sharing it? Morning, everyone. I see we have our expert speaker on the call, which is great news. Jay, thank you for joining.
Good morning. Sure.
Do you want to check? You can share your screen, and we'll start in a couple of minutes.
I assume you can see that.
Yeah, sorry, I asked you to do that and then didn't confirm the thing. Yeah, it looks great.
No worries. Okay.
Okay, there's a couple of people still joining, so we'll give it two more minutes, and then we'll kick off with the topic. Thank you. It's auto recording. Okay, let's start. So thank you for joining, everyone. This is our October office hours. We had a couple of suggestions for topics, but this was one that I think we all thought was very important. You know, building policy is at the heart of what's powerful around our API gateway, and knowing how to build that policy is important, but once it's built, or if you've inherited policy from somebody else, debugging it is vital. So we have got one of our most experienced policy writers, or probably one of the most experienced policy writers there is, full stop, to give us a presentation about how to debug policy, some of the techniques and ways of doing it. And then after that, we've got a little bit of a preview of something we're working on right now, which is around debugging encapsulated assertions, which I'm sure Jay will probably touch on. But yeah, this new feature we are working on right now to make the debugging a little bit easier for some of those scenarios. So Jay, over to you. The session is being recorded, guys, and we will be able to share the slides with anybody, I think, afterwards if you want that. So I'll let Jay get on. And Jay, hopefully you're okay with questions at any point. If people want to put those, if people want to put those in the chat, I will be monitoring that and kind of shouting out if it's a good time to ask a question, Jay. But anybody else that wants to ask, please shout out and ask. That's the whole point of the session. Thanks, Jay.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I would like to see this turn into, kind of devolve into just a dialogue about this stuff if necessary. So, okay, I've put together, there's not a whole lot of flash about this presentation. I hope everyone's all right with that. But I put together a short presentation, and I'll switch between this screen and the actual policy manager to illustrate a few of these things. But we'll start with a bit of an overview of policy debugging. And what is the problem? Largely is that policy can very quickly become spaghetti code. So troubleshooting it and debugging it, unless it's like well-written, good readable policy, is honestly a nightmare. So, you know, if you've inherited somebody else's policy, I'm sure some of the people on this call have done exactly that, and then something starts going wrong, how do you actually troubleshoot that? So, and honestly, it doesn't just apply to, you know, inheriting other people's policy. The number of times I've had to go in and work on policy that I wrote, you know, either, you know, could have been last week, it might have been a decade ago. These things happen. So really the fundamental thing about policy debugging to me is making sure that from the get-go you're writing good readable policy. And part of the, one of the main keys to that is to use comments. Honestly, comments add nothing in terms of performance effect. They do not impact the performance at all, but they do make your policy very readable. And for those of you who have come across some of my policy, you'll see that just about every line, certainly every folder will have some kind of an inline comment added describing what is going on in it. And something like a rich comment block at the top to describe everything possible about this policy. So when you come back in, or when another person is coming in and looking at this policy to try and understand what is going on, without having to piece by piece pick the policy apart, they can rapidly get an understanding of, okay, what does this policy do? Other things like, consolidate functionality into all blocks to make it more readable, and then put a comment on that block to say what is going on inside. Now, the way policy works is it's a Boolean logic based language. So anytime that we have, an assertion fails, then that affects obviously the flow of the policy, and we try to get policy, your objective is a failure should fail all the way to the root level of the policy. So by putting things into these all blocks, if something goes wrong inside of it, it fails that functionality, gives us a better grip on the logic itself, thus making it easier to troubleshoot. I've got this invert your logic with a question mark, something about writing policy that a lot of people do to make it more complicated in a way that you can simplify things, thus making it easier to troubleshoot, is when the question is asked, is A equal to B, do C? We may want to ask the question, is A not equal to B first? It's one of those aspects of policy writing that definitely makes things simpler and easier to read. And ergo, when you do invert your logic, if that is a better way to look at the policy, make sure that you've got a comment that describes how that policy is working or how that logic is working. And finally, wherever you're using reusable code, modularize it with policy fragments and encapsulated assertions where appropriate. I tend to use a lot of encapsulated assertions in my policy, but on occasion a fragment is the right thing to use. So the tools that are available to us for debugging policy, really your best friend is the audit and log system. Understanding how auditing works and how logging works in the gateway is really fundamental to working with troubleshooting things. And I leverage the audit system and the add audit details assertion heavily, absolutely. And I'll describe how I do that. There's the debug trace policy, which is a utility that you can enable on any service to run a little snippet of policy after every assertion that has available to it details about the assertion that was just executed. And as a result of that, we can, and it dumps it by default all into the audit system. My problem with it is it's a little bit too verbose, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We have this tool that was introduced a couple of years ago in the Policy Manager called the Policy Debugger. I will be perfectly honest, I have not used the Policy Debugger that much. I've dabbled with it, but I find where it's very useful is when developing policy. But once you've got a policy written and you're coming in to troubleshoot it later, the Policy Debugger becomes a little bit less useful, and I'll discuss that as well. And then finally, I've got TCP dump in here. It's not exactly something for debugging policy, but oftentimes policy gets blamed, and the actual what is going on is happening on the wire, and TCP dump is the way to see it. So we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. So the audit and log. We all know, or hopefully we all know, that auditing can be a performance killer. So understanding how it works and how to minimize it in your policy is essential to make it effective. And some of the tricks that I use, for example, this equal greater than symbol, I use that as a prefix in a lot of my add audit details assertions to distinguish customized audit details from stock ones. So I've got a sample policy here. I'll look for an add audit. This is a great example right here. So when I search on add audit details, it comes up with a lot of these add audit details that I have. And notice how there's equals signs at the beginning of each one, and they tend to ramp up in the various sections of the policy to sort of give myself an understanding of, what level of the policy are we in as we move into these different folders, or just information about what's going on. If I'm in a loop or something, then I'll add an extra equals. It's quite personal how you do this. But what is important is in the future, if I'm coming in and looking at this stuff, making sure that it's easy to find when I'm going through the audit record, or if this happens to be in a log that we're looking at it, and that we can easily find this stuff and also get an idea of at what level of my policy am I by using this fairly crude but effective method of indicating where we're at. Yes, definitely. The only time we want to be using a warning level in our add audit details, because as soon as you have an audit detail at level warning, that will trigger an audit which will affect our performance. So oftentimes I come in and I see that people have written, a policy with an add audit details at level warning that really doesn't deserve level warning, that's triggering an audit. That affects the performance of the gateway just by doing work it doesn't need to do, especially in a busy system. So be careful about when you're adding these add audit details to make sure that you're only trapping the failure scenarios with an audit detail level warning. Everything else should be at info, and most of what I do, actually, I audit them at level fine, and we'll discuss that in a bit more detail here. The fine level logging by default, when you configure the gateway, is not going to get recorded. And once upon a time, adding fine level audit details was also a performance killer because we evaluated them all. But there was an improvement that was made a few years ago to the auditing where adding fine level details does not appear to have any kind of effect on the performance. So I tend to litter my policies with fine level audit details, and we can see that here. Here we go. So this is just one I pulled up at random. I'm searching active connector definitions at level fine and going into the audit system. So most of the time when this policy is running and everything is working just great, if I have not configured the gateway to capture this stuff, then it will not get recorded and it will not affect my, my performance. Now, to get those to be recorded, we have to set a a cluster-wide property, which is the audit detail threshold. If we set that to fine on the gateway, then any time that an audit is triggered in an executing policy, then it will record all of that information. So most of the time, we don't care about the type of details that I put in with the fine level audit. But if something is going wrong and I'm on a production system and I need to capture this type of information, then I just change that cluster-wide property and possibly some other configurations to generate the information I need out of the logs to get it. We're not going to have the luxury of going in and using the policy debugger typically in something like this when you're in a high-level environment. So we tend to have to rely on forensic information. And the best way to get forensic information is through the audit system. And one strategy that I have done in a couple of places is to use policy to selectively enable auditing for specific services. And you can do this either with an encapsulated assertion, or my preference is a global pre-service policy. And to show an example of this, here I'll pull up my pre-service policy. I've got this encapsulated assertion, which is conditional audit messages and policy. If I take a look at that policy, it's a very simple one. I'm checking to see if the gateway.audit services cluster-wide property contains, or in this case, I've inverted my logic, does not contain the service OID. Now, every service on the gateway has an OID associated with it. If I look at the service properties, it's this guy right here. That is a unique identifier of this service that is always available to policy. So in my pre-service policy, we've already resolved to the service. We know what that value is. And in my global settings, right here, audit services, I've dumped in one of them. So this will turn on the audit messages and policies if that cluster-wide property contains that service. So this is one strategy I've used at several customers historically to allow them to go in and simply modify a cluster-wide property on a gateway to specifically target auditing on a specific service. Again, this all boils down to we don't want to be generating too much audit information for performance reasons, but on occasion we do need to enable auditing on something to get that information that we're looking for in order to troubleshoot it. Now, I've talked a lot about auditing, and then there's, the companion system to the audit system, which is logging. It tends to be less of a performance killer. It comes with its own, suite of issues as well, things like trying to correlate the logging information and so on and so forth. There are ways to tag your entries in the log. I won't go into the details on that. But suffice it to say, there's in the add audit details assertion, there is a custom logging field that can be set. And I often use that to aid finding records in a log file. So I'll pull up that. Okay, we've got add audit details. So if we're going to the log, I would turn this on and something like just calling it debug. What that will allow me to do when we check on the audit box here, the audit button, that will force this audit detail into the audit system, which gets processed at the end of the policy. When we check on the log button, that processes this little snippet of policy to dump something into the log file right away. And that can also be a very useful way to capture our information. The decision on which of these you use, whether you use the audit system or the log system, depends a lot on how you're capturing this stuff. And I've had dozens of conversations over the years with customers about which, what is the best way to extract your audits and logs off the gateway and to offbox them. Whatever the case is, however you do it, the important thing is to send good information to however it is that you're extracting it. The old garbage in, garbage out argument. We do have the capacity to have separate log syncs. I find it's usually not that necessary. The main reason is as soon as you set up separate log syncs based on filtering on a custom logging field, the performance will be affected because it will start writing to 2 or more different log files, because it always writes to the gateway, the SSG00 log, and then it will start writing to a second one. So if you do these properly, everything that's going to be put into the ssg00.log file will be available to you. You don't need a second log file, and then you can parse that log file, or using grep, or if you're using a system like Splunk or Elastic, all of those have utilities for parsing through the log files. So again, what matters is giving these systems for searching the logs the right information to be able to extract it. And finally on this, a trick that I started using a number of years ago, and with Aaron's feature that he's discussing about adding encapsulated assertions to the policy debugging, I'm looking forward to seeing that. But a problem has historically been, how do I know where I am in the policy? And what I started doing was adding at the beginning and ending of every encapsulated assertion this add audit details at level find, saying I'm entering, and then put the policy name as a context variable. So when I do that, and this is exactly an example right here. I have it at the beginning, entering utility fragment policy name, and in this case, I also wanted to record what the value of refresh was. And then at the end, I've got leaving utility fragment. So when I'm going through my troubleshooting logs, if I see that I have entered a certain fragment recorded in the audit details, but I don't see that I have left that one, I know exactly where to go in my policy manager here to start actually finding the problem. And the number of times I've gone into somebody else's policies or some of my own policies, and they're calling it encapsulated assertions, and you don't know exactly where it's failing, you waste a lot of time getting to the point to say, this is where it has failed. Now, the second tool in the toolbox is the debug trace policy. Now, it is a little snippet of policy that gets called after every single assertion that is executed in your policy. So every assertion generates an audit detail, which when we're dealing with big policies simply becomes overwhelming. When you're, having to fish through hundreds of executed assertions to find the problem, it's untenable, it's unsustainable, I think. I've spent a lot of time going through debug trace policies. I don't enjoy doing that. I find it much more effective to write policy using, what essentially this is doing to give me targeted information in a safe manner. But if you do use a debug trace policy, and I'm not saying not to use it, but use it sparingly and understand how it works and know how to use it, I always modify the default debug trace policy that does the issuing of the audit detail. The default you can see here it's very long, which just makes it more difficult to read through everything. So I find that changing it to something that gives me a little more terse formatting of it. It also removes things like service name. We don't typically need to know the service name in a policy, when we're executing this, because we already know the policy that we're looking at by the audit record itself. That information is stored somewhere else. Something like the policy GUID, we typically don't need to know the policy GUID if we're getting the policy name. Information that is extremely valuable is trace.assertion.number.str, and this tells me exactly where in this policy we just executed. A short name for it to help me more easily find that assertion in the policy I'm looking at, and then information about how long it took and what the status is, which will typically just be 600 or 0. So the debug trace policy, yes, definitely useful, but something that can really make your life difficult when we're dealing with bigger policies. So if you are using it, plan to make it a little more effective. Now the service debugger, very short bit of information. As I mentioned, I haven't used it that much. My biggest issue around things like a service debugger are that it does require control around the calling of a service. So if we're in a development environment where I start at the policy debugger and then I execute the call to it, that's great. And it's wonderful in that type of a situation. I don't use it that often because I'm just addicted to using the audit system and putting in proper logging that tells me the type of information that the debugger will do. But if you're in a production environment and you enable the policy debugger or the service debugger, and as soon as you initiate it, if somebody comes in and hits that policy, you're seeing their stuff, which may not be the controlled information you're attempting to submit to the debugger. So I definitely, I don't discourage its use, but know where it is useful, and that it can also be, problematic in its nature. And last, TCP dump, capture what is on the wire, only as a last resort. We often, it's a classic statement around the Layer 7 community that 9 times out of 10, when somebody points the finger at the gateway, it's actually not the gateway, it's somewhere else. And, they'll say, well, something's wrong with this policy or whatever. So you go and you look at the policy, you spend, a significant amount of time troubleshooting the policy, only to realize that that instance that they were sending is not what you're expecting. It's not feeding into the policy properly for whatever reason. And in order to troubleshoot the policy, you're going to also need to know what is the information being fed to it. So TCP dump is definitely one way to get that, probably the best way. Sadly, or fortunately, TCP dump is not installed by default on the appliance. Having a packet capture tool on a security appliance is a bit of anathema. So if you are planning to use it, it will need to be installed on the gateway. We talk to support about that. And once you have the packets and you understand how to read them using Wireshark, you're well on your way to figuring out what's going on. I find myself using TCP dump quite often with customers that are running into issues that they're just not sure what's going on. Something weird is happening, they say. So let's take a look at what's happening at the wire. I'm not going to talk about in detail another tool that we have, which is the DCT, the data collection tool. It falls well out of the scope of policy debugging, but sometimes when something's going wrong and we're trying to troubleshoot it, and again, we've spent a lot of time in just going through the policy that's having the problem, we determine there's something else going on with the gateway. Support will often ask you to run the DCT, or data collection tool, so that they can then take a look at all of the other characteristics of the gateway at the time. So in summary, there is no substitute for writing readable policy, none at all. I can't stress enough the importance of making sure that you've got lots and lots of commenting. Without this information, out here on the right side, I always separate it with a double slash, but whatever you're comfortable with. I should never need to open up a folder block to see what's going on inside of it. I should have some indication. That way, if I'm coming in to troubleshoot this, I can say, okay, I don't need to look down here. I know that that is working properly. When I talk about a comment block, this is what I'm describing here. And in my, when I develop encapsulated assertions, my comment blocks get quite verbose, describing, what is the encapsulated assertion this is backing, what does it do, a few notes about it, and then the inputs and outputs that I'm going to be looking at, because this view that we have up here of our inputs and outputs may not be available depending upon how we're looking at our policy. If you bring in the policy that isn't attached to an encapsulated assertion, you'll want to know this bit of information. So again, ad nauseum, make sure you're making your policy readable and making it easier for people in the future, including yourself, to come in and understand what it is that you're doing. The leverage audit, ad audit details strategically. Let's see if I'll go ahead and access that. Where do I have it here? Here it is. So when I hit this service, let's take a look at our cluster properties. Okay. So I'll go and look for cluster host name to see if anybody is actually using it. Okay, this is a long, complicated policy, and I'll go and look at my gateway audit events. All right, never like to see that. So this is the gateway dependency analyzer, my associated logs, and I can see all of these arrows indicating what is going on. That is custom information over and above what we had with everything else. All of this is level fine information. I can pretty much ignore most of that. Now, if we also had a debug trace going on, there would be a whack more stuff to filter through. Wow. Okay, so here's my leaving utility fragment, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes it a lot easier for me to trace through my policy what's going on. So I'm entering get all policy XML and leaving it, entering it, et cetera, et cetera. So this allows me to quickly isolate where the actual problem is and work down into it. And as I said, Service Debugger is useful during development, but in my opinion, less so in higher environments, mainly because of the control that you have over the call, and only use TCP dump when necessary. So with that, I'll hand it back to Aaron and open the floor for comments and questions.
Yeah, thanks. I thought that was really valuable. I'm sat here with Francois, and we're both, both 10 years experience with the product, and both kind of nodding and going, "Oh, that was a really cool way of explaining stuff." And yeah, I think it was a really valuable session there, Jay. So thank you very much. Anybody got any questions? We do have the other topic, which is around the encapsulated assertion debugging, which we can go on to. But anybody got any questions for Jay right now before we do that?
I have maybe one question. I was just wondering if you have, for example, something like a routing assertion, which fails with an error. Is there a possibility that you can easily capture the error to send it to another system? Because from time to time, we want to send to a Kibana, for example, but then we want to know the exact error, why it failed on the backend. And sometimes the routing assertion can fail because the DNS, it is a DNS issue. It can be a timeout. I know there are internal variables like the audit detail index, and then you can iterate to find there somehow the latest error. But is there a more easy way to identify the latest error, why your policy failed?
Yeah, unless you write that into your policy, No, it's difficult. But for example, and I don't, do I have one on here?
Yeah,
I
because you
don't
can
think I
indeed
actually
catch
have.
all the errors, but I sometimes you just want to have the native error catched from the system, and yeah.
Yeah, at the moment, short of going through, looping through all of the audit information and so on and so forth, it's a bit painful to get that. And that is why, so you used an example of the routing assertion, which is absolutely a key assertion. And when I write a policy that routes to somewhere, I always wrap my routing assertion in an at least one, where the first assertion is going to be the route, but if the route fails, then I've got information, what is the context variable, the reason code that comes out of the routing assertion. I can evaluate that. So if let me.
Yeah, that's what we do today also. We validate, so we put in it in at least assertion. But I was wondering if I could capture easily the real error, because sometimes it can be, for example, the backend is not available, but it can be a certificate that is expired, a DNS issue, a read timeout. I have multiple errors on the same assertion, and it's you can build the logic of to find out all the types of things, but then your policy becomes quite complex, because in the end, if you check the audit statement, you have it already. And what I today now do, I just do a run. I do a loop where I loop over you have the audit index. I have something like audit details, and you can run it as a loop over it. And then if I find something with routing inside, then I have more or less the latest error found back in the dump.
Right.
But it's a workaround. But maybe there was a better way that maybe there's directly a variable available where you have the latest error message from your policy.
Unfortunately, no, and that I'm aware of. I think that's a great idea. Aaron, are you listening? If something fails, we just should load up a context variable with what that failure is. Now, what I usually do, and I'm going to kind of go meta on this. One.
Dave,
I will.
Sven, have you used fault assertion? It usually provides all the details.
Amog, you're really faint there.
I'm traveling. Can you hear me okay now?
Sort of, yeah. What? Say it again.
Have you used soft fault assertion? And within soft fault, there is a full detail drop down. So if you select full detail, it usually gives you pretty good details on what the error was and why a particular assertion failed.
Oh, in the modify soap fault response.
Correct.
Yes. As a general rule, I avoid using that. Actually, I completely spaced on that. That's a very old school way of troubleshooting things. The information the problem with that is the response that you're going to send back will carry all of the information for why it failed. And if we're in a controlled development environment, that's all well and good. But if we're in a production environment, we don't want to be letting the client know why we failed. That's very bad idea in my opinion.
Right.
So
thanks for bringing that out. So
let me.
So
go ahead.
Good. So thanks for pointing that out. So maybe I need to connect with Sven later. And again, in order to protect the security of the API itself, we should publish some details, but not all of it. So regarding the Kibana usage, Sven, I'm not sure if are you using containers, or are you still expecting OVA appliances to publish logs on Kibana?
Both.
I mean,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah, we're doing both. So now we're going to switch to containers. So therefore, but anyway, we want to feed our Kibana, and today I use, like, we have also portal integration. We use the buffer approach where we put data in a buffer, and that we then send to a Kibana, and then there we have one JSON string that we can easily parse.
Okay.
And this is sometimes an issue because we send a custom response back with because we don't want to say indeed why it failed. Sometimes we just want to give it a default error back, but then we want to have an internal error where we know exactly why it failed. And we want to avoid that each time a technical person needs to check in the audit logs, but then we can check on our Kibana system why a certain error appeared, which is a bit easier to give people access to it as well.
So I'm showing here right now an example of what I would do is set my routing assertion, but if this routing assertion fails, then the reason code is going to be set to anywhere from 1 to 5. And I can't remember what the numbers mean, but basically server not found, read timeout, connect timeout, bad URL, or there's reasons for these. 5, as I recall, is unknown. So in my policy, for something as crucial that's talking to a third party, where the problem may be at the third party, we don't know. If this succeeds, fine. But if it does not succeed, then I need to record that. I need to trap that. And those, I would put them all at level warning to make sure that we trigger an audit. And that will put, that it was a bad route or whatever into my system, my logging system that I will be analyzing with Kibana or Splunk or whatever. This is usually then followed by another, at least one at the root level, where I'm going to evaluate reason code to see whether it was 200, which means a success, or do we have a 400, a 404, a 500, all of these other possible response values, and I will build the logic into it to say what's going on and to record that. And very often I'll take all of these guys and pop them into an encapsulated assertion so that I can reuse that effectively in this kind of logic. So obviously my routing is going to be custom to this policy, but the processing of a failed route is reusable code, and I'll put that into a fragment.
Cool. Jay, there are a couple of other questions. So I think maybe we can, like Amog said, maybe we can we'll reach out to Sven and have a separate call on that topic. A couple of other questions. Well, one comment from Francois just saying wisdom nugget, invert your logic. Yeah, we were both kind of saying that I got there by accident, and that's a really great way of explaining it. There's a comment or question that says, is using variables in comments, does that give, basically, I'll reword slightly, does that cause performance issues? I think that it's not necessarily in comments, but on, right into the audit or the login system. I think the answer to that is no, right?
No. I mean, obviously, anytime you're evaluating anything, there's a cycle being used. Is it affecting your performance? Typically, no. We have to do these things. So, and that being said, I'm going to put a caveat. In the past, we have had several context variables that are addressable. For example, the one that I use a lot is the policy.name. And there was a bug a number of releases ago where evaluating policy.name came with a huge performance burden for some reason. I don't remember what it was. And on occasion in the past, we have stumbled across those kinds of bugs in the product. So I'm not going to say the absolute answer is no, but it's a safe assumption, in my opinion, that it will not be a performance issue.
Yeah, obviously someone could have, 10 meg of information in a variable or something stupid, and that would what might affect it. Okay. The other one, which I think is a good question because it leads us to talk about something else quickly. Can we have the policy fragments called dependency analyzer list policies? Absolutely. You've actually posted that on our public GitHub repo, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe someone, Greg, maybe in the background, if you could, if we could copy and paste the URL into the chat window for people. But we do have a GitHub repo. We're going to be trying to put more and more things like this very useful policy that Jay has built on there, policy-based, script-based, those kinds of things that sort of fall outside of the product, but we think are valuable to you. So this is one of the first things we've put on there, and thanks to Jay for sharing it. But we'll put that in the chat window in a second, so you guys can access it, try it out, and give us some feedback. So yeah, given we've only got sort of 13 minutes left, Raju, do you want to take us through the work that we're doing on policy debugging for encapsulated assertions?
Absolutely, Aaron. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll start sharing my desktop.
We can see that now. Yep.
Okay, cool. So let me connect to my policy manager, and see right now this is I'm running the policy manager and the gateway from my local machine. So it's not been integrated with any released environment or any development integration. So still it's in evaluation phase. You might see some glitches. So sorry for that. But let's get into the action so that we could discuss more about it. Okay. So I just connected to the policy manager where I opened one of the service policy here, that is hello, and it has few assertion called include policy fragment and some encas. Its name is Monday and other policy fragments. So the reason I selected all these assertions particularly because they are actually made out of other assertions which are part of other policies, not really the service. So even though they look like a inline, but their definitions are defined in separate policies. That we all know that. But especially when you really want to debug the service at the policy level, so there are some limitations that we already know. We cannot step into the NCAS policy definition, though we have a capability of stepping into the policy fragments. So yeah, this is exactly where we are trying to fill the gap. So that means if it is really get into the product with a nice way, you would able to get into the NCAS policy debugger just like we used to do for include policy fragments. So yeah, before jumping to the debugging, so from the policy editor point of view, something similar that we show the include policy fragment definition in line to the policy editor editing. So we could also see the NCAS policy definition right here by expanding this node. So as you can notice, this is NCAS. We still could able to see its definition right here. Just as similar as we do it for include policy fragment. Those things are still be not editable right away in line to this particular NCAS assertion node. Everything will be shown in the read-only fashion, but still you could see almost every assertion which are defining this particular NCAS. Of course, you could get into the more deeper if you really want. So I'm just trying to show you that what is the difference that you would notice out of these changes. Okay, so this is from the policy editor point of view, but the real one is service debugger. That's exactly where we could see some value out of it, especially in the development environment as Jay articulated before. So it is not really recommended to use the service debugger in the production environment where you don't have a much control over service invocation, but you do in your development environment. So let me open the service debugger for this particular service, and I'll put a debug breakpoint at my first assertion, and I'm trying to invoke this service using my curl command. Okay, probably I did not click on the start. Okay, so my service debugger catch the debug breakpoint, and we could jump into the include policy. That's fine, but let's see what we can do with the NCAS. So here also I could jump into the NCAS policy definition, and I could easily go through step into even deeper level in case if it has any other NCASs. And in case if it has any include also, we can go that. So that means we don't see any more gaps with respect to service debugger point of view. So that's exactly what we are trying to fill the gap here. So yeah. So, and one more thing is, in case if you really want to put a service debugger right inside something, probably let's see whether it works or not. Start. Yes, it did. So it catches the debug breakpoint even at the deeper level of encases the definition. So yeah, this is what we are working right away. So I'm open to question now in case if you really want to see something else in this context. Yeah.
That's great, Raju. I think that will make the debugger a lot more helpful for people as they're building policy. Like we said, we still have some work to do. It's still some things the service debugger could do differently. You know, Jay's comment about it not being as controllable as it could be maybe when you're in production, knowing which transaction you're debugging is important. But yeah, I think that's a really good addition. So thank you for showing that. We are working on that right now. Obviously, like Raju said, that's not in the product yet, but we are working on it. So if you've got feedback or you want to put a thumbs up, in the chat, happy to get feedback from there or comments. And we have 5 minutes left. This seems to happen every time on office hours. I'm kind of thinking we should maybe kind of push it to a 90-minute call. But any questions on the topics you've seen, the demo from on the encapsulated assertion stuff, or anything else you think you want to ask? Now is the time. Any topics for next time would be more than welcome as well. We like to do topics that people actually come up with, need help with. That's the idea of the call. So yeah.
I have a question for Remco in the chat. So basically, is the NCAS content not hidden in the policy any longer once this feature is available?
So is it really for the security reason that you don't want to show the definition? You want to keep the older behavior, at least from a showing point of view?
Yeah, because that's the strength of the encapsulated assertions to hide all the content for developers, and not from security reason, or from a developer's perspective. Just call it with the properties and make it simple. Make the policies very short in content, because that improves readability. So,
yeah, this really valid point. So we will try to make it a choice to the policy author, at least, like whether we could show the NCAS definition while editing the policies, but show the NCAS debugging ability from the service debugger at least. So if we could differentiate these two things, probably this would solve the problem. We'll definitely consider this point. Thank you.
it also is shortening the policy when you have the checking for the policy available. Because when you use fragments, it checks all these assertions. When you use an encapsulated assertion, it's very short, and then your check is more quick.
You mean the validate policy part, Remco?
Yeah, yes, the validation, yes.
Okay, I think, you know, like we said, we're working on this, so there's some good feedback there. I think we'll always have to balance the fact that if you want to do debugging of an encapsulated assertion, at some point you're going to have to be able to see in it. So, but I get that it may be as this is a development tool, not a production kind of debugging tool. Maybe that is fine, but yeah, we'll take some of that feedback and talk internally and see if there's any changes we want to make, and reach out to you guys that commented there if we want to validate anything. So yeah. Thank you.
It will be a great feature when debugging, so that's really great.
Yeah, I think from anyone that's written complex policy and used encapsulated assertions, I think there's some real value there. There's some great topics being put in the list, in the chat, list of topics to use. So we will process those and make sure we pick a good topic for next month and publicize it early enough so you guys can get on. Any other questions or topic suggestions people want to share out loud? Okay, I'm aware everyone is either busy at the end of the day for some of the Europeans or busy starting the day for some of the guys in North America, West Coast, etc. So I will end the recording there, and I will thank everybody for their time,